Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome to TELSIG. I'm Phil Martin from the University of York, and today I'm talking with Paul Kirschner. Paul's an educational psychologist and professor at the Open University of the Netherlands. He's a strong advocate of evidence-informed teaching, and so if you want to know whether the latest buzzwords in learning do genuinely help students, then his books like How Learning Happens and more recently Instructional Illusions are well worth checking out. Paul also hosts a lively Substack page, which is where he's covered the main discussion points of today's podcast. And the first of these is based on the findings from a fairly large controlled study last year that looked at the effects of phones on learning in the classroom. And results pointed to going phone-free in class brought fairly hefty learning gains, as well as levels of engagement in class. So all of this poses the question of whether we're actually curating the tech that we like to use, as well as we might be. The other conversation point is on how we deploy terms like cognitive offloading to talk about AI's utility in teaching. This has been widely used and, as Paul argues, often misunderstood. So if you've not visited Paul's Substack yet, then I recommend doing so. Links, as always, in the show notes. Paul's a hugely influential voice in education, and he's very much sought after as a speaker, so it was really a privilege to have him on the podcast. And without further delay, I bring you Paul Kirschner. I'm here with Paul Kirschner. Paul, great to finally meet you at last.
Thank you very much.
I think most of our audience will probably know you from your educational psychology work, and they'll be very familiar with your books and articles. I only just realized it was 450 publications you're now on at the moment.
It's 450 and growing.
Yeah.
Still.
That's quite an achievement. The real reason that I was interested to talk to you today was a couple of points that you've covered off on your recent Substack, which was about confusion around terminology from the field of science of learning. And I think I recognize you also have an aversion to the term science of learning. So maybe we'll do some definitions in a minute.
Yeah.
Can you kick us off with that then? How do you define your field?
I'm a cognitive psychologist, so I study how people learn. And you could call me an educational psychologist in that I look at how what I've learned from cognitive psychology can be used and studied for teaching and learning. And that's just about it. I don't need to go any further.
So the study that you looked at on your Substack, so is this idea that the presence of phones in the classroom have an adverse effect on learning? And I think the study that you reported on had a sample size of about 17,000 participants.
I take issue with the thing that your opening statement to this, and that was that it's unavoidable. Schools and teachers can ban the use of cell phones. It's just as simple as not unavoidable. I mean, it's as unavoidable as smoking in the classroom or drinking coffee or tea or whatever in the classroom. If you make the rule that there are no cell phones allowed in the classroom, in the school, then there are no telephones, there are no mobile devices. So it's not unavoidable. It's very avoidable. You just have to make policy and keep to the policy.
How would you talk to teachers about getting them to control devices in the class? Because obviously, I think the article mentioned a box, perhaps collecting them.
Yes, we have a number of things in the Netherlands. You have a box that you can collect them in. You have pouches that you can put them in. In high schools, students tend to have lockers. You can say, well, it's either in your locker or at home, but not in the classroom. It's just that simple. And if you have it in the classroom, then you're either going to be, banished from the room, or you have to hand it in, or you can get it from me back at the end of the day. Those types of things. But it's the same as any rule that you make. It's not being mean or anything like that. You're actually being very benevolent, and that you want your students to learn, and you don't want them to be distracted and disrupted by mobile devices. So you make the rule and you hold to the rule.
Yeah, my comment about it being unavoidable, we're at a digital first situation, certainly in the UK at the moment, where all teaching materials have to be in digital form on our virtual learning environment. I've started printing things, and we can go back to analog in many ways. But we also run up against accessibility regulations where things have to be put in digital format for accessibility. Have you come across these kind of objections in your discussions with this?
Well, most of the things in the classroom are done by teachers and with teachers.
Mm.
The materials themselves are things that are usually done in individual study sessions or at home for homework or studying or doing a report or something like that. In the classroom, it's the teacher who's taking the lead, and I assume giving a lesson and not saying to the kids, go read this on your screen.
Mm.
If they are, then they're, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, shirking their responsibilities as a good teacher instead of saying they're offloading their teaching responsibilities to the learning materials that a content provider provides.
Mm.
And I don't think that's the role of a teacher.
How would
Yeah,
you get the study, the results that came out of the SSRN article, which you talked about on
yeah,
your blog? One of the questions I had when I was reading your sort of take on this study was, how new is this information? Because I seem to remember looking at, we've known for at least 10 years. I seem to remember reading a study that was talking about the effect on our scores in tests just by the sheer proximity of a device, even if it was switched off. And
yeah.
this is a thing that we've known about. Was there anything in the article when you read it that was actually surprising, or does this kind of like just gel very neatly with what we already
No,
know?
nothing very surprising at all. As far as I remember, it doesn't surprise me at all. What surprises me is that it has to be said and that it surprises other people. I
Yeah.
mean, it's the same as it doesn't surprise me that open space classrooms don't work. But I still see schools designing with large open spaces for students
Mm.
to learn in, and they can't, like it's companies have learned that it's not very good for their workers. Schools have learned that it's not very good for learning. Teachers abhor it, and it still is done. So those are the things that surprise me,
Mm.
not the results of good scientific research. That's like in any event, with my background and my background knowledge, it's kind of like I didn't expect anything different.
So it's how have we how involved do you get in policy kind of conversations with on around these kinds of things? Because it does seem to be. I mean, I've noticed a real uptick when I've gone more analog in my classes, and it's been a real. It's kind of like having a weight taken off in some ways, and you've gone from. It's only something that I've introduced relatively recently. I'm ashamed to say I've really kind of I have taken technology as kind of a default. It seems strange when you talk to other people. They say, you do what? You're going to use pen and a paper. So it's that curation of technology which it has become harder and harder to do. How have your conversations gone around policy? Have you talked to any sort of policy makers? And I'm thinking particularly of higher education, but I know you've done a lot of work with schools as well. How's it?
Now,
How's it?
I've talked to people at the national government level, and they finally decided to introduce things like bans of using mobile phones in schools. But no, most of my discussions about these things are with teachers, and they're often not discussions, but it's more like, oh, thank the Lord, I'm now
Mm,
hearing it from someone else who is knowledgeable in the area telling me that what I've thought all along
mm,
is actually the case. And how can I, like implement this in my classroom?
mm,
And I think the best way to do it at the policy level is to get teachers to realize that and revolt against school leaders who think that it should be different.
mm,
Like what you're talking about, what you're doing, just do it.
mm.
It's your classroom.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that the recent barrier I've come up against was analog submissions. So trying to get students to submit a non-digital piece of work
Yeah.
is a lot easier said than done.
Why?
Because we have to have a digital trail for the most part,
Yeah.
and
Well, if you need a digital record, you can scan it in.
yeah,
I mean, it's the technology goes very, very far. So
mm,
you can scan it in, and if you need to have it translated into a Word document, it's even the case that what you scan it into is often capable of making a Word document or whatever
yeah,
from it. So the idea that you need a record of it and It's a pity that it needs to be a digital record because it could
Mm.
be just put in a filing cabinet or whatever. But okay, you don't have that much room. You want a digital record, scan it in. I mean, it's the same thing I tell students when they want to use their laptop to take notes. I tell them not in my classroom.
Right.
And the reason for that is because they can usually type as fast, as quickly as that I can talk. So it goes in their ears and out of their fingers, kind of like a
Yeah.
court stenographer. And they don't think
Mm.
about it. And I want them to think about it. If they have to summarize what I'm saying, if they have to paraphrase what I'm saying, because they can't write that quickly, they've never learned shorthand, then they're processing the information. Okay, explain that to them. But then they say, yeah, but I need it for my notes. And I say, no, you don't. You say, well, I can't read my handwriting. I said, well, there are these digital pens that don't cost very, very much. Write it with your digital pen, plug your digital pen into your laptop, and you'll then get a digital copy of what you wrote down. So there's absolutely no problem, and you can distribute it or whatever. So it's almost for every technological problem that
Mm.
teachers and students tell me, there's also a technological problem to solve it. Yeah?
Yeah.
So if you need a digital record, you scan it in. If they want to take notes, I say, well, use a digital pen and then download it or offload it from your digital pen into your computer. And your computer will learn your handwriting. And what's even better? If you make a drawing, that can also be offloaded into it. But if you're taking notes on a laptop,
Mm.
you can't make that flow chart of how a certain process is, because yeah, you're not going to go change to you're not going to change to some type of Photoshop app or something like that
Yeah.
to make a flow chart. So you're actually not going to write down what you need to write down because the tool that you're using doesn't allow you to write it down, but a pen does.
Yeah. When you were coming up with How Learning Happens, I was just
Yeah,
rereading some of the chapters over the
yeah.
weekend. I didn't see explicit mention made in the theories that you were covering there about the importance of distraction-free environments for how learning happens. I think you had
Well, I do think it's just scattered throughout the book.
yeah.
We even have one thing in it about how noise affects. There was a really nice study in Chicago schools of a classroom that was on the elevated railway side of the school and another one that was on the non-elevated railway side of the school. And they found that those on the elevated railway side scored more poorly, learned less well because of the auditory distractions of
Mm.
it's hard to call it a subway if it's elevated, because a
Mm.
subway, for some strange reason, means you're underground. Maybe because at this point in time in education, there's no seminal article. I mean, the subtitle of the book is about seminal articles in.
Mm.
And in the 28 or so chapters, because the last two are more general chapters, they're all about a seminal article about something, which means, of course, we had to not cover certain aspects because there are more than 28 seminal articles or more than 28 important things you can talk about in education.
Mm.
But also, it's the possibility that I couldn't find a seminal article dealing with visual and auditory distractions.
Mm.
Yeah, the only thing that it would be a good article about seductive details, but seductive details are different from what we're talking about here.
Yeah. I reread recently Deep Work. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that with Cal Newport.
No.
And some of the work Jonathan Haidt's done
Yeah,
on the role of phones in fracturing attention. And I think,
yeah.
what Cal Newport was writing about was very much that, if you want to do good work, and we'll class learning stuff as deep work, then, things like not just social media, but the phones in general, just creating this distraction-free
Mhm.
environment where you can spend
Yeah.
some hours on that, but I'm not sure. Again, as you say, I'm not sure if there were a list of references at the back with studies referred to that sort of underpinned the thinking. But
Yeah.
that's interesting. A seminal article.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
just
that's what it is. It is also seminal articles of original research.
mm,
So Jonathan Haidt, as far as I know, I haven't read all of the things that he's written, has written primarily books.
mm,
I don't know if he's done empirical research or that he's just making use of other people's empirical research in his books. And this other person, Carol Nuke, whatever.
Cal Newport. Yeah,
Yeah. I don't know if she publishes original,
yeah.
original research about the topic. And if they don't, then the chances of being in the book are fairly slight.
Yeah, I think they're, in both cases, their role is more like public communication of existing
Exactly.
stuff. Yeah.
And
So, yeah.
the articles that I'm talking about are, or that we use, are seminal articles in cognitive and educational psychology
Cool.
that give us information about either how we teach and learn, or the second one is how teaching happens, but they're all about research on and not someone translating research on. Yeah. I always have a problem when people cite my book in their articles, because if they're citing something in my book, they're citing it from a chapter about someone else's article. So cite the original article. It's not that I want less citations. I have more than enough, and I'm 74 years old, and I'm not going to make any academic progress by having more citations or things like that. And it's flattering that people read the book and refer to it, but my book would not be a chapter that I would write in a book about seminal articles.
Yeah. Well, this links to a point that I'm going to come back to in a bit, time permitting, but it's just this idea of like how we make things slightly more resting on empirical information that we can reliably use to inform teaching. But the other interesting point which your Substack covered was this confusion around terminology. And this was around, you specifically zoomed in on cognitive offloading versus outsourcing.
Yeah.
And again, I thought this was really interesting because it allows us, what we really need to do is engage in debate as to whether or not certain technological tools or any tools are effective and suitable for use in the classroom.
Yeah.
And in the terminology allows us to kind of engage in this discussion. So one of the things that that article really cleared up for me was the argument that I often get, which is, well, we're going to embrace AI, and let's pick on AI again for a minute. It could be anything, but like we're going to embrace AI because it's just another tool. It's just like a calculator. And if you didn't object to calculators, then, how can some version of this?
Yeah.
And that has never sat well with me. I've always kind of thought, I know there are differences, but now, when you lay out the terms very clearly, one is outsourcing, one is offloading.
Exactly.
If you can say that a little bit more eloquently than I can. But
I don't think so. But I mean, the difference is offloading is that our working memory is very limited in time and size. It can only handle 4, 5, 6 new elements of information at any one time. And if you do something with it within 20 seconds, it's gone. That's very simple. So if you're doing something and you have to, if I give you a difficult problem, like if 5 days after the day before yesterday is Thursday, what brings it tomorrow? Yeah, something like that. And you try to do that in your head. I'll tell you, you'll get very lost. I've tried it myself. If you have a piece of paper and you put down 7 days of the week and you work with that, it becomes a much simpler problem, because you don't have to, 2 days after yesterday, what was that? And you have to keep that all in your mind at the same time. You have to constantly subtract and add days to it, things like that. Your working memory becomes overloaded. So if you have a piece of paper and you write it down, you're offloading a certain amount of the cognitive load that you have. But you're still doing the calculations yourself. You're still thinking about, if it's 2 days before, then it should be that, and working with the 7 days of the week and in whichever order and going backwards and forwards. You're doing all of the work, but the only thing is you're not keeping it all in your head at the same time.
Mm.
That's cognitive offloading. huh? That which you're normally using in your working memory for processing, you put it somewhere else so that I just do it. And you can do that with adding 7 numerals up together, or long division, or whatever. You can do that and use
Mm.
pen and paper. Outsourcing is you let somebody else do the processing for you. Somebody else or something else do the processing for you. And that's what AI does. It's not helping you in terms of freeing up working memory. It's taking the place of your working memory. And then you're outsourcing it, just like you do in a company when you get rid of your delivery department and you go over to a logistics firm. Then you're no longer doing that. Someone else is doing it for you.
Mm.
And what you're doing is you're giving them the right questions. I want, or what you need. I want to be delivered within 48 hours of when it's ordered or whatever. But you've outsourced that work. And that's what AI tends to do with outsources. If I can take one small step backwards, I was one of the people who was against making use of calculators. And the reason was very simple. I thought it very important that you automatize mathematical processes, that
Mm.
you know from yourself that 7 times 8 is 56, and not that you have to type it in. Because if you're confronted with a problem, it's often needed, even if you're at a soccer match, at a football match. It's often necessary to make a calculation. And if you can't multiply 7 times 8, or we have this many teams in the competition, that means how many games are there in a season? If you can't do the math, that's a problem. So I thought from the beginning, it's great, give them a calculator, but first let them learn to calculate themselves. And then
Mm.
you can make use of the calculator to offload things. But if you've learned to multiply, you don't need to offload it because it's in your long-term memory. And when you need it, you just grab it from your long-term memory. You don't carry out that calculation in your working memory when you're solving a problem. You just
Mm.
grab it out of your long-term memory, and you make use of it. So you don't even need to offload it. But that's a different thing. Calculators do different things than AI. You still have to punch things in and get a result and do the calculations, even if someone else is doing the math for you.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
with AI, that's not the case.
Yeah, I mean, because when I do get into these conversations about AI, and I use it myself, but when I think about the classroom and when I think about how to use it, and I'm primarily working with students learning languages, so
Yeah.
but this apply across all domains. I mean, I'm often scratching around trying to think of an example that it would be useful for, that aligns with what we know about cognitive architecture. So what it would do primarily is it removes friction in the learning process, which is kind of the opposite of what you
It's the
want.
exact opposite of what you want. You want friction. You want desirable friction, or as Robin Elizabeth Bjork called it, you want desirable difficulties.
Mm.
You want students to think about what they're doing. And if you give them the possibility to let something or someone else think about it, that they don't have to do it when they're not learning, because
Mm.
learning is the processing of information. And if you're
Yeah.
not processing the information, you're not learning. It's not called machine learning for nothing.
How would we think about evidence that we would need in order to make decisions? Because one of the questions I was going to ask you off the back of the phones discussion, so the SSRN article didn't tell us anything we didn't really know. We could have inferred the results from what we do know about, digital distractions, how the mind works, screen versus paper-based learning. In terms of AI, where we know we can see mostly it's a streamlining tool, it doesn't require technical thinking. It requires you to talk to it like it, on a very sort of personal level. We can infer that it's unlikely to offer that many learning gains if you insert it into the classroom. And now I know that longitudinal studies take time to come out. We need a lot of data, and these things take time and they take resources, and this stuff has only been open for a few short years. Is there any kind of research that you'd like to see in this area? And is there anything that you any kind of potential learning gains that you can see AI playing a constructive role in? And I'm thinking classroom based. I do see a lot of articles that say it could potentially be a learning tool and personal tutoring and things like that. I'm just thinking in the classroom, is there anything you can see that it could help learning?
It could help learning in kind of the same way that typical drill and practice computer applications help, but possibly a little bit more intelligently. What a normal drill and practice computer program for language, for mathematics, for science, for whatever is, if you get it right, you go to the next level. Or if you get it right twice in a row, then we'll
Mm.
give you a more difficult one. But that's kind of like a very shallow and simple algorithm. I can have two students who get the same two questions or tasks right, and one has done it in a matter of seconds, and the other one would had to think 20 seconds, a minute about it before finally coming up with the answer. And I would say, well, the first one had it more fluent than the second student. So the first student, I might choose to give a more difficult task, whereas the second student, I might want that student to practice a little bit more until the process of solving the problem is more fluent. Now, I think that you can probably make use of AI to deal easily with not only correct answers, but also response time. I think you can make use of AI to discern certain types of mistakes that a student would or could make when solving a problem and sees it. You could also do that in a computer program, but that asks the teacher for quite a lot of extra work beforehand to think of
Mm.
what are the typical system mistakes. The teacher knows them because when the teacher's teaching and not letting the computer do it, a student will give an answer, and that expert teacher will immediately say, oh, that student doesn't understand the difference between offloading and outsourcing.
Mm.
And we'll deal with that. But that means if you want to have a machine do that and do it for groups of students so that you can do other things as a teacher, and that's not just sitting over backwards and, like working with specifically with other students,
Mm.
if you want to do that, that's kind of like very, very hard to do that beforehand. They'd have to think of all of the possible mistakes and what the antidote is for the mistakes that students make. So you might come with 2 or 3 very typical ones in multiplication program tasks, and for example, but you probably won't have all of them. And the AI can do that, but it's more an addendum to what the teacher's doing. It's
Mm.
not teaching the students.
And presumably it comes at an opportunity cost as well. I mean, if you are integrating it into the curriculum, either in the classroom or as a study addition, perhaps it's going to come at the cost of something else that the students or the teacher could be doing. Is that? I mean,
Well,
that
I mean, the thing that usually comes at the cost of thinking.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. And that's my whole problem with it, is
Mm.
that you want students to think. That's
Yeah.
it's both a goal, but it's also part of the process.
Yeah.
And you want to have them think while solving a problem, and you want to teach them to think and have them be able to think. And by letting someone or someone else think for them, they won't think while solving the problem, and they won't to learn to think
Mm.
about the situation. If you bicycle your child everywhere on the back of your bike because you can ride a bicycle, but that child can't, that child will not be able to magically jump on a bicycle and ride that bicycle, because what
Mm.
you've done is you've taken away every opportunity for that child to learn to ride a bicycle. You've taken away all the possibilities to practice riding a bicycle, sometimes falling down, sometimes scraping their knees or their chin. Of course, you give them a helmet, things like that. But you've taken away all of that. So both the process and the product, learning to ride a bicycle and riding a bicycle, become impossible. Now, that's what AI is at this moment often doing, taking away the chance to think and to process information and losing at the end the goal, the ability to think and process information.
Yeah. One of the things that I do hear, I guess is probably the most frequently spoken advocate of using AI in education. And this is this idea of critiquing output. And when I think about how this might work, so it would be, well, AI will produce a text, and that's a great opportunity for students to critique and thereby learn. And I know you've written a lot about, you've taken issue with the idea of unguided learning and the importance of explicit instruction. And to me, this runs directly counter to that, because if I'm running a language class and I'm trying to teach students certain aspects of structure and various other things, they might use ChatGPT to generate a text and then critique it, but they don't have the knowledge really to get anything useful out of that. I mean, especially we know the kind of prose that ChatGPT will produce. They will look at it and think, well, it looks okay to me. I don't really know what I'm supposed to be learning from this. And each student will have it's not like the teacher can point to parts of the text, because each student will have their own different version. Have you heard this? Have you come across this idea before? Or have you argued about it?
I've heard of it, yeah, vaguely people talking about it. But I mean, if I was a teacher and in a language class and I wanted to make good use of ChatGPT, what I might do is, as a teacher, prompt ChatGPT, or whatever large language model we're talking about. It could be Perplexity, it could be Grok, it could be what Claude, it could be anything, okay? But prompt them in such a way that that you ask it to make the mistakes that you want the students to see. Then you can give them that, yeah, and ask them to critique it. Then the next step would be, after they've done that and handed it in, and for that matter, it could be electronically, it could be a Word document that they make use of comments and changes or whatever, and do it. And then say to them, now take that and have it critiqued by ChatGPT and see what it comes up with. And has it come across the same problems as you came across? Why? Why not? Those types of things. But that means you're not going to ask students to write something with ChatGPT, which in itself is an oxymoron, because they don't write it with ChatGPT. ChatGPT does it. They prompt it to ChatGPT to write it for them, and then ask them, possibly without the necessary fundamental knowledge, to review it and comment on it, where they possibly lack the knowledge to do that.
Yeah,
I see that as a non-desirable difficulty.
And also something else that arises is you're sacrificing the teacher-student contact, because you're kind of putting the screen in between the teacher and the student. And I think this is a point. I was reading Jared Cooney Horvath's book over the break. I saw you wrote an endorsement of that, and he cited some studies that show the effect of the role of empathy in the learning process, and that kind of knowing that there is a human on the end of the text and the involvement of the student-teacher relationship. I mean, so again, we're back to this issue of cost. So there's a trade-off there. It might be an efficient text creator, and we can see ways that teachers could make materials. But when we talk about students using it, there's that additional cost of empathy, which seems to have been relatively strongly borne out as being a factor.
Well, the student empathy, but all other aspects of the student-teacher relationship is necessary, plays an important role, whether you're seen as being real or let's say authentic or not, whether you're seen as being the authority or not. That plays an important role. That's the reason why teacher feedback tends to work better than peer feedback, because your peers aren't seen as an authority, you as a teacher are seen. But you have to create that feeling of authority with the students. And if you don't have the proper interactions with them to do that, you won't be seen as authentic or authoritative or empathetic or sympathetic or whatever. So, like that's also an important part, although the social psychological aspects aren't my traditional hunting grounds with respect to cognitive psychological research.
Okay, well, let me just, I'll steer us back into your area of expertise then. So just the
That would be
final
nice.
question that so one of the questions that I usually ask guests that appear on the show, like widely published, is about like research directions, and especially how teacher researchers or practitioner researchers can contribute to the body of knowledge that
Yeah,
we're generating here. It's very tough for teachers with their load to get involved in research because of the time cost. It's really tough, and we end up doing studies or narrative research studies, small scale sample sizes, which are valuable and they're useful and they can contribute. But I think I was going to ask you how you feel about that kind of research versus the kind of gold standard,
auto seeking.
large data sets, controlled studies. Do you think it's possible for teachers to cross that bridge and get involved in that, or
I
what
think
kind
it's
of?
possible up to a certain in certain ways and up to a certain point. In
Hmm,
certain ways is if you create and I know of, but I couldn't give you the name of the people who are doing it at the moment, just out of my head. People who are creating environments in which individual teachers can add their classroom research, and I'll tell you why I'm giving you air quotes in a second. Yeah, can contribute um, classroom research so that the sample size becomes larger and larger and larger, and it gets much more ecological validity because it's done in real life learning situations. But if you have that, then it would be a great idea and every teacher could do that. And
hmm,
now comes all of the caveats with that. Most teachers have been trained to teach and not do research, just as most
yeah,
researchers have been trained to do research and not to teach.
yeah,
Yeah. Which means that when a teacher comes to me with a setup for a piece of what they call research and a questionnaire, I look at it and I think that it's, let's call it next to worthless,
hmm,
because you can't do any research with that. Their questionnaires have been validated. They jump from A to Z to Q to M, and the scales are wrong, and they don't have a theoretical foundation underpinning the research that they're doing. That's all necessary to do good research. That said, I have nothing against teachers doing research, but they also must have learned somewhere how to do proper research. In any event, the basics of it. Most teachers haven't. It's not
hmm,
an integral part of their teacher training because their job is not to do research, but to teach. The problem with what they've learned is that they also haven't learned how to evaluate research. So they read an article and they can say, well, if this is the premise, can I derive this from what the original premise is? Often they don't even ask that. They don't ask, is the methodology that has been used the proper methodology for studying the research question or hypothesis that has been posed? They haven't learned to read, understand, and evaluate research that often was not a part of their teacher training. So I think it's very unfair to ask teachers to do research, and it's
hmm.
even unfair for them to ask them to evaluate research until they have the foundational knowledge they need to both do it and or evaluate it. And if they don't have that, then you probably won't get very good research that you can do anything with, even if you have that aggregator, which I discussed at the beginning of this segment. even if you have that aggregator, an aggregator of poor research doesn't by sheer numbers give you good research.
I think we want things that we'd be able to look at and reliably say, okay, here's an intervention in the classroom we're focusing on technology in the classroom or as a learning aid. This has an effect size of something,
Yeah.
or something that contributes to that goal of being able to say something.
If you had someone in the school who is a research lead, I think that's what they're called in England, that is a research lead, that if a teacher wants to do a piece of practical research, that person is capable of sitting with that, just as I would do with someone who comes to me and wants to do a PhD or carry out a piece of research. From what's your basic theoretical foundation of this? Is this question that you pose a research question that can actually be studied? Has the intervention that you've chosen, is that capable of studying the question that you've posed? Can you evaluate the results in a way that gives you a clear answer to the question without all other types of contaminating factors? Because what the teacher will do is the teacher will often institute an intervention, but also change 17 other things in how they're carrying out that research. And can you say at the end, that intervention was the reason, or the other 17 things that I did?
Yeah, I mean, trying to isolate variables in a teaching context
It's really
is
difficult. So that means the research lead would have to say, can you implement your intervention and keep all other things equal?
yeah. And the answer is usually no, I would
And
assume.
the answer is usually no. And if the answer is no, you don't get an answer to the question because you don't know if adding pre-questions to a classroom situation has helped if you haven't controlled for all of the other things that have also changed. And if they've changed, then you don't know if it's the questions or those other things that you've changed. That's the problem with program research, because usually if you go from explicit instruction to problem-based learning, you haven't only changed the pedagogy, as you would say in England, but you probably also changed 16 other things within that curriculum. So how can you say at the end, it was the intervention of problem-based learning? Maybe it wasn't that at all. So, most teachers will be doing program research in thinking that they're changing something, but they're changing a lot of things. But a research lead in a school could be a first thing. Getting EEF in England to set up such an aggregator in which standard methodologies, I want to study retrieval practice in my classroom and how it works, that there was a template for carrying out that research so that every teacher in England that wants to do research on retrieval practice and report the results can do it with that template that an institution like EEF has produced, so that in some way the results obtained by all of the different teachers doing that can be aggregated. Of course, you have no proof of whether there was fidelity, which means that it was done in the way it was supposed to be done, and 16 teachers can do it in 16 different ways. But in any event, you've introduced something that could lead to more validity and reliability in the results found. And I think a lot of teachers would like to have that template also, because they don't have to think about it.
Yeah,
But
they don't have to
also,
build from the ground up.
yeah,
I appreciate we're hurtling headlong towards your 3:00 meeting. So
yes.
the only other question I had that I was going to try and squeeze in was what you'd like to see from an educational psychology point of view, any research or large scale studies that would really help add to the body of knowledge, either through replication or testing new ideas in terms of technology interventions in the classroom. Is that
There are two possible areas, although I don't have a crystal ball. Okay.
Mm.
One area is that I'd like to see more research on the combination of proven interventions, because we talk about retrieval practice as though it's something isolated, but it also, retrieval practice relates to spaced practice. So I'd like to see well thought out research that combine two, not too many, maybe three, proven interventions, but in a methodologically valid way, so that we can see how different tools for learning interact with each other. Okay? And that could go as far as underlining and another thing, because we say underlining doesn't work, but if you use underlining and then afterwards to write a synopsis, maybe underlining will have an effect, which we now say it doesn't. So that might be the first thing that I'd like. I see combinations of interventions, methodologically studied. The second is that I'd like to have researchers do more research. I started doing that and then I retired on a cognitive theory of multimedia assessment. We have a cognitive theory of multimedia learning from Rich Mayer, and we've had it for years, and there's been quite a lot of research about it and a whole of the different principles that are included in that. But we have no good comprehensive theory of multimedia assessment, while multimedia assessment is gaining traction in a lot of different places. So you're doing an assessment of music, and you're then making use of video and audio, and we have no idea how you could best implement that for assessment, because assessment is quite different from learning. In learning, you're trying to, I won't say make it easier, but you're trying to implement the media in a way that helps students learn.
Yeah.
But if you implement those same principles in an assessment situation, you're possibly making your assessment less effective, because you're clearing down the trees so that students can see the trees for the forest. Whereas you might not want that in assessment. You might want them to have problems seeing the trees for the forest, because you want them to be able to decide what's important and what's not important. Well, the cognitive theory of multimedia learning says, don't add seductive details, because it'll crowd up the learning situation. So maybe you want assessment with lots of seductive details. I'd like people to do research on a cognitive theory of multimedia assessment.
Yeah, and I think the point about that, I've seen many things that people propose as assessments that I often think that would make a great learning tool, but it's not.
It's not an assessment tool. Exactly. Yeah. So those are the two areas of combining interventions to see whether it strengthens or weakens, or maybe isn't necessary, the second thing that you've added, because it just works just as well without it. That makes it a lot easier to design your instruction, if you know that. And if we're making use of multimedia assessments, it would be good to know that we're doing it according to a theory of what is a good multimedia assessment and how do we implement that.
Yeah, something to lean on, basically.
Yeah, like the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, which we can lean on when making multimedia learning materials.
Yeah. Another podcast episode there, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, Paul, you've been amazingly generous with your time. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
You're very, very welcome.
Run to your next meeting now, but
I will
link to your Substack and related reading in the show notes below. Yeah, Paul, once again, thank you very much.